Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Bible study. We're going to be closing out our discussion of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, which is the first section of the Sermon on the Mount. And we've already heard Jesus goes through the Beatitudes, the famous statements, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who are, all the way through, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And we talked about how many of the fathers read this as a progression, through various stages of virtue. Likewise, Jesus comes to tell us that he has not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And we said fulfill has two meanings. It's both to complete the law perfectly in his person, to enact all the precepts of the law, and also to give us what was sort of missing in the law, the incomplete portion of the law, which of course is the inner dimension of the law. So whereas the law, the Old Testament, the Torah tells us you shall not kill, Jesus tells us that you shall not even be angry. The Torah tells us you shall not commit adultery. Jesus says you shall not even lust. He also says, the law says don't swear falsely, and Jesus says don't swear at all, but live simply. Let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. Now we're going to so we can understand everything Jesus has done thus far as filling out the law of Moses. People have the image of, I think, we have sort of this image, this pop culture image of Jesus in our mind that like, oh, the Old Testament was super harsh, and Jesus just was like peace and love and came to make everything easy. And what we've said as we've been dissecting this is actually virtually the opposite. In fact, Jesus made all of the commandments of the Torah like 10 times harder, because it's relatively easy to not commit murder. I've been not committing murder all my life. However, I've been getting angry almost every day of my life, probably. And that's a whole lot harder. So we're going to now these teachings of Jesus, the fulfillment of the law is kind of going to be summed up in these last two paragraphs, which we're going to read. So without further ado, let's go to Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 38. So, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. So, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This is from the Old Testament law, and people have interpreted it in a very negative light and saying, oh, God, again, this whole idea, which is completely false and Gnostic, that the Old Testament God was somehow harsher or meaner than how God reveals himself in the New Testament. But it's that the law given in the Old Testament was adapted for a certain time and place. Nevertheless, it is still just. It is still fundamentally good. It's still from God. And how are we to understand this? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth sets a limit on the amount of vengeance you can take. It is not commanding you to take vengeance on people. It's saying a limit. You cannot, if someone takes your eye, the most you can do to them is take their eye also. You can't kill them, basically. You can't kill somebody for injuring you. You can't kill somebody for insulting you. And this is relevant. I thought back to something very topical, but do you guys remember that there was a shooting at the Kansas City Chiefs Super Bowl parade like a year ago in 2024, you remember? It was two groups of young men shooting guns at each other. Do you know why they shot at each other? You can go look this. I wanted to go before I did this lesson. I wanted to go look. They started shooting at each other because one of them looked at the other funny, and they got into an argument, and that's what it was. This was a perfect opportunity to apply the law of the Old Testament. They started shooting, and one person died in this incident. This thing is very much human nature. We want to kill even for insults. And so this tells us that if someone looks at you funny, the worst thing you can do back to them is look at them funny back. So this is a fundamentally just law. But Jesus, like as he's been doing in these previous passages, is extending it even more. The law says, you can take vengeance, but you can only take proportional vengeance. And Jesus says not to take vengeance at all. The original law set a limit to retaliation, and the completed/fulfilled law now bans it entirely, gets rid of it. Eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's what we call justice. That is fair. That is fair. That's justice. But Jesus is coming to give us mercy. which in a sense trumps justice, which is even not that injustice is not a bad thing. Fairness is good in general, but mercy is even superior to that. Evil and vengeance form a cycle. By the way, this should be obvious, but Gandhi, who was critical of the Christian religion, Mahatma Gandhi has a famous quote, "An eye for an eye would leave us all blind." And I think that was him saying something negative about Christianity, but on one level, he is kind of right. Even if you just have proportional vengeance in retaliation leads to a cycle of vengeance and retaliation. The only way to really stop evil in the world is to cut it off at some point and not repay evil for evil. And that's, of course, what Jesus does on the cross, is he takes everything evil into himself and doesn't retaliate. And in that way, it's just destroyed. It's completely, crushed. But as we've said before, the way the fathers understand this, apply the teachings of Jesus to their life is, they're seeking spiritual growth. They're speaking spiritual progress. And what St. Augustine tells us is that to not resist an evil person leads to perfect peace. That is the way to get inner peace, is to not get caught up in this cycle of vengeance and retaliation, but just to let things go. So it's not just that Jesus is commanding us to do this and we have to obey his will, but we are going to be better off for it. We are going to be healthier and happier if we don't get into the cycle of vengeance. I think there's could just be the kind of thing I saw on the internet one time. It might not actually be a real quote at all, but I do remember there being like a quote from Confucius or something that says, when a man goes out to seek vengeance, he must first dig 2 graves. He has to dig one for his enemy, but he has to dig one for himself, because the quest for vengeance will not lead to satisfaction. And again, I might be totally butchering it because I don't remember 8th grade English that well, but I'm pretty sure that was the plot of Moby Dick, was that he sought out and got his vengeance, and it didn't mean all that much to him. In the end of the life, at the end, it was a hollow victory. So it's not just we obey God for obedience's sake, although that is good and that is blessed, but we actually benefit from obeying God. We benefit from applying these commandments. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. The par excellence example of this is who? It's Jesus himself. I mean, he was physically struck on the cheek. He was physically beaten and crucified, and did not retaliate, but actually allowed it to happen to him. He said when Peter tried to defend him with the sword, he said, "Don't you think I could call my Father and he could send 12 legions of angels?" Jesus could have stopped the crucifixion. He did not need to let it go through, but he allowed it. So that's the ultimate example of turning the other cheek, not just giving your cheek, but giving your whole body to your persecutors, to allow yourself to be killed. Anastasia, yes?
Yes, I just recently saw a video by Father Spiridon Bailey concerning that turning the other cheek thing,
Mm-hmm.
and he had a totally different take than I'd ever heard on it.
Can I hear it?
He said that basically the cheek that got slapped was hot, it was angry, and turning the other cheek was actually turning the anger away and not retaliating. It didn't mean to give another target. It meant to stop it.
That's very good reading. That's a very good reading of it. And like we said, the fathers, when they read this stuff, they're thinking always about the state of the soul. What condition does this produce in the soul? And I'll come up with some other examples of that as well. But that's a very good way to read it. At the same time, there are examples of when this was physically carried out by the saints. So there was some at one point when St. John of Kronstadt, who was like a celebrity priest and well-known miracle, he was actually attacked by some anarchists or communists or whatever. This was in Russia before the revolution, who struck him on the cheek, and he gave him his other cheek so that they could hit him again. I don't think they ended up hitting him again. So it is something he's a saint. So we should not preclude any one definition. These are all valid understandings of this law. But we are bearing the weakness and sickness of others like Christ. And that's what, reading the commentaries of the fathers on these passages again and again, they're referring to people who do you harm, people who hurt you, as sick people. These people have a spiritual disease, and it's their anger, it's their hatred, it's their malice towards you. They're actually the wounded ones. And by not retaliating, you are bearing with their weakness. The example of that's so they use multiple examples, but one of them was a doctor who's treating they didn't have these words, but like someone who's schizophrenic or someone who's psychopathic who totally lashes out them and tries to harm them or kill them or whatever. The doctor doesn't usually, or at least if he's a good doctor, doesn't retaliate to them, but he understands that they're sick and he tries to help them despite the fact that they've tried to harm him. St. John Chrysostom had a very funny example. It was funny for me because sometimes you realize that you're reading, commentaries from a very different place and very different time. But he's like, oh, don't you know when you're watching a woman give birth and sometimes she just bites the people around her? And I said, no, I've never seen that happen. I've watched my wife give birth to 3 children and she never tried to bite me, although she might have if given the chance. But it was just very funny to me. But he said, notice that when a woman's giving birth and she's in so much pain and she bites the person next to her, that the person who gets bitten doesn't retaliate because they know she's just giving birth. I thought it was just very interesting because it's like clearly he's speaking from like a totally different cultural context, like a totally different experience. But you understand what he's saying, and it's a good illustration. Yes.
Service and they're screaming or like crying.
Mm-hmm.
They're not like chastising it. They're like, be quiet.
No, that's a great way to look at it.
It's just a child in nature. So
right.
Innocent.
And they don't know better, and you hope the hope and plan is that they're going to grow up and they are going to know better at some point. Just like the sinner, you tolerate them in their sin, but you with the hope or with the expectation or hope or desire that they do eventually reform. You don't want to leave them like that. But it definitely, when I'm reading this stuff, I'm thinking about my children first and foremost, because that's an example of you tolerate a lot of stuff from your children, and you just love them no matter what. But nevertheless, it is, St. Augustine does point out, it is, and we've talked about this in previous classes, there are situations in the world where one is not just justified in, but obligated to not turn the other cheek. You can't have a society if the authorities turned the cheek about every crime or anything like that. But rulers, people who are entrusted with keeping the peace, like police officers or whatever, soldiers, are under certain circumstances not to turn the other cheek, but they can do so dispassionately. You can enforce the law without necessarily having hatred in your heart, and that's what Anastasia Raven brought up the good point, that this can apply to a disposition of the heart as just as well as it can apply to a physical action. You can enforce the law without hatred, without malice, or without desire to destroy somebody, but just because this is what's necessary to keep law and order. But again, most of the situations in our life, turn the other cheek applies. Most of the situations in our life, we're not, when we're wounded or we're insulted, it's something we need to let go. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. So one of the things, the first thing to sue you in specific, one of the things that comes up elsewhere in the Bible, but also in but elsewhere in the Bible, but also very much in the fathers who are coming on, they're adamant that Christians should not take each other to court. They should not settle dispute in the court of law. At very least, not in a court of law that's composed of non-believers. That is totally. They see that as totally messed up, totally not right. And historically, there are spiritual courts. Nowadays, our Orthodox spiritual courts in the United States only apply to like matters like of the church or so on and so forth. But historically, spiritual courts have been, part of Orthodox societies, and I think maybe in Lebanon still, because they have this like fascinating legal system where there's like a civil law, but then the Muslims have there's like a criminal law, but then Muslims have their own civil law and Christians have their own civil law. I don't know exactly how it works. I'm not Lebanese, but I'm told that there are everyone in Lebanon has their own religious legal jurisdiction. Fascinating. Anyway, fact check me on that. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that is something real that I've heard. Just trust me, bro. It's a shame. I remember, gosh, one embarrassing factoid. So my wife is a barred lawyer, and she has to take continuing legal education classes to continue to remain a licensed attorney. So just a few times a year she takes these classes, and now they're all online, so it's easy. But one of her classes, I don't know, she just told me, or maybe she wasn't supposed to tell me, I don't know, forgive me. But like one of her case studies of Virginia law was two people like from our church at the time. It was Greek last name versus Greek last name, and it was like a case study, and they broke down the like, it was really sad actually, because it was like an intra-family dispute. But it was anyway, it was shameful. You know, it's a disgrace. It's an embarrassment. You know, not judging them in particular, but just generally that situation. If for heaven's sake, we're being used as like, you know, case studies for lawyers to like discuss. I mean, that's an embarrassment for the church. That's an embarrassment for us as Christians. Anyway, so that was a funny thing. But let him have your cloak also. So, you know, St. Gregory of Nyssa, I think, said, the salvation of the one who robbed you is more important than your property. All of this stuff is passing away. Nothing that we own materially matters all that much in the great scheme of things, but persons matter a whole heck of a lot, because human beings are eternal. Just the other part of this is that we shouldn't be too attached to worldly things. We shouldn't be so in love with our tunics or our cloaks or whatever. And now, mind you, these are things we need to live, tunics and clothing. But if Jesus is saying that this about like our essentials, it should really apply to our non-essentials. We all, you know, in the modern day America, have lots of things we can part with that nevertheless we can get so attached to. And that is wrong. That's not how we're supposed to be. And we need, and so we need to turn the other cheek, not just when it comes to insult and injury, but in terms of you know, things that people do against our property as well. Again, there are always exceptions to the rule, right? I'm in charge of this church, and I think, and you guys donate money to buy the nice things that are in this church. And I think everyone would be upset with me if I opened the doors one day and told a bunch of people on the street, here, come, just take all our stuff. You know, that would not be an appropriate. And if someone tried to rob the church, it would be incumbent on me to, you know, stop that and tell them to go away. At least with certain holy vessels in the church, that was the whole thing. Anyway, but so there's situations when this doesn't apply, but in general, we have a lot of stuff we can part with, and easily. And Jesus is, and I think it's a little easy sometimes. We hear these really extreme statements of Jesus, and we want to give ourselves excuses. You know, our first instinct is to say, well, I don't have to do that because X, Y, Z. And I think on one level, there really are exceptions, because human life is messy and complicated. On the other hand, you know, we shouldn't be so quick to give ourselves the easy way out. These words challenged Jesus's hearers, and they should challenge us. How are we living? How attached to worldly things are we? Do we actually care about the people who do us wrong? You know, it should be, you know, for ordinary human life, it's a no-brainer. No, of course we don't like the people who do us wrong. Not what Christ called us to. Christ called us to care about them and their salvation. Okay. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. This is an interesting thing, because it's referring to forced labor, which I feel like we don't deal with as much in the modern day. But if in the olden days, in ancient times, and I think still in the modern day, in like some third world countries, you can have a situation where if the government is building something by your house, they might just grab you and say, hey, stop whatever you're doing. You have to come build our road for no pay or for low pay or whatever. And so that at least when the Father's reading us, this is what they seem to they think of referring to, is forced labor. Someone's making you do something for them. And it's self-explanatory. It's like the other examples. It's not only to not retaliate, not only to not fight back, but even be obliging and be helpful to the person who's oppressing you and persecuting you. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. This, by the way, when the fathers are reading this, and especially, I think there's an equivalent passage, I think it might be in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says, lend without seeking anything in return. This has always been understood to refer to lending with interest. It has always been a sin in the Orthodox Church, in Christianity, to charge interest, because you are because if you charge interest, you're not giving someone a helping hand. You're attempting to profit off of them. So it's not a friendly or congenial thing to do. It's a means to exploit another person. We are currently living in a world where our entire financial system is built off of interest. It is not good or healthy. Everyone knows our economic system is bad. I don't know the strict definition of the term capitalism, and I think a lot of people use that word a lot of different ways. But we're definitely in an unjust money system, and a very weird money system. Whereas one of the big problems with interest is that you have a bunch of money coming out of thin air. So you give $1,000, you don't do anything, you personally don't do anything at all, and then you receive $1,100, you receive $1,200. You created a $100, $200 on top of your original investment from nothing, from thin air. That money isn't attached to anything physical or real. And now we have, this whole financial system where tons of money is not attached to anything real. I mean, think about like stock valuations. Like huge amounts of our financial system are just made up. They're just numbers on a screen. And of course that leads us to all kinds of messes and financial crises. And I don't know the intricacies of it, but the only point I'm trying to make is, according to the gospel, according to Jesus Christ, our financial system is unjust. I look around me and I see, yeah, I can believe that. Yeah, I can believe that this is built on a mountain of exploitation and nothing. And and that's not me saying like communism is good or socialism is good or anything like that. We in the Orthodox Church, we know from experience that these things are false idols, and and even if they correct for some injustices, they're going to end up unjust in other ways. But I'm just letting you know that this has been part of our faith, and we shouldn't give it a free pass. We shouldn't say, oh well, the whole world's doing it, now it's okay. It never was okay. It's still not. Yes.
So is the sin on the part of the person loaning the money or the person receiving loans too?
Oh, the person loaning. I mean, I sometimes, I think historically, especially, people turn to money lenders like that because they're desperate. So I think they could totally. I mean, maybe that person is using it in a sinful way. I don't know. But historically, it's entirely on the person loaning at interest, not necessarily the lendee.
A lot of third world countries, how they can put people that are desperate into like sort of debt slavery, like oh, I'll give you a loan, you have to work for me for 7 whatever years, and then sometimes they'll just like kind of cheat you and be greedy and just keep you there and keep you enslaved essentially.
Oh yeah.
I feel like the whole interest is not only just the injustice, but just the greed that can come with it, and the corruption and the control that kind of comes from people that are just out for the interest and control other people. I don't know.
That's a really good point. Yeah, no, I mean, it can get you in this cycle of basically de facto slavery. You don't need to look to the third world. I know people like that who, have used credit cards to pay off their medical bills or whatever, and now they're just stuck under that mountain. And they can't keep up with the payments, so they're never going to be free. I mean, it's just, slavery in a different name. And people get upset when the Bible sets, at least in the Old Testament, sets rules about slavery. It's like, well, there are forms of, slavery and everything but name, even in the modern day. It's something you can't really seem to get rid of from society because, anyway, Benjamin.
Could it be, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can it be said in a way that, like, if we willfully, as Christians, accept loans, that we are causing others to sin, and therefore we ourselves are also sinning?
That's an interesting question. I wouldn't go that far, because what other choice do we have in a lot of situations? My wife and I, took out a huge loan called a mortgage on our house to buy a house. And so would it be like more just, like, were we sinning by doing that? Would it have been more just for us to just rent for our entire lives? Okay, maybe it's self-serving, but I don't want to say that that's the case. At least I don't think I committed this heinous crime by getting a mortgage to buy a house and build equity or what have you. But at the same time, we are participating in an unjust system. So I would say, the same way that, babies born into the world, they're not personally guilty of Adam's sin, but they're all kind of stained by it. Like we're already kind of warped and twisted by sin from the moment of our birth, even if we're not personally guilty because we're children and we're innocent. I think likewise, those of us living in this, capitalist or whatever society we want to call it, we're not always sinning per se, but we are mixed up with sin and we're wounded by sin. And, I've said the same thing about, we're mixed up with governments that perpetrate all kinds of wars and crimes against humanity. We're mixed up with the food system, which is is terrible to animals. Like we're mixed up in a lot of sinful systems that we didn't personally start, and we're not going to be able to dismantle ourselves. Like they're going to keep existing and being cruel. But so we're mixed up in sin, but we're not always, personally guilty just for having contact. Does that make sense? That's how I see it. That's not a dogmatic statement of the Orthodox Church.
What about if you look at it, it's not necessarily capitalist society, but consumerist society. Like a lot of us, I've been guilty of this dozens of times in my life where I upgraded something with a loan. You want a different version of a car or a new TV or something. Most people aren't buying TVs with straight cash. They're doing a month-to-month thing. That isn't really a necessity or a need, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So you're definitely guilty of materialism or self-indulgence or whatever you want to call it by getting things you don't need, for sure. Is the main issue the way you're doing it? Would it be less sinful if you just paid cash for your TV? I don't think so, necessarily. I think the means of financing it isn't necessarily the issue, or it could be. I could be wrong, but that's how I see it. But the primary sin there is greed and self-indulgence or whatever.
But my eyesight, I have to have 84 inches.
Yeah, that's right.
When I was younger, it was fine. I could use the 13-inch TV. But I gotta have 84.
Yeah.
Because
I can't hear you. I gotta get surround
yeah,
sound.
I definitely.
Right. We all, it's a funny thing, this world we're mixed up in, and the reality is there are people in this world who challenge us and show us just how little we actually need. Anyway, so. In summary, the short summary of this paragraph so far is Christians should endure insult and injury without retaliation. We've covered that there are some exceptions, but in general, this is the rule. And we'll explain why that is, a little further down. And the fathers are rather, literal in reading all of this. They see, give away your cloak and your tunic if someone is demanding them of you. And these are necessities of life. These are things, and this is in an age when people had a whole lot less, even wealthy people. Allow yourself to be physically hurt in certain circumstances. Again, in general, this doesn't apply when it comes to other people being hurt, right? If someone slaps you, you can allow yourself to be harmed, but that doesn't mean you're supposed to turn the other cheek on behalf of your wife or your children. That's why things get messy. That's why things get complicated. That's not being it's not being Christ-like to watch someone being hurt and unjustly and just do nothing. It's I'm turning the other cheek on their behalf. No, that's not how things work. But in general, at least insofar as it regards personal insult, personal injury, we need to turn the other cheek. And we receive a blessing from God in exchange for our sacrifice, right? So, if you read the spiritual literature of the Orthodox Church, they see it again and again. This or that saint complied with someone's unjust demand, and they suffered so much, but then they received incredible grace from God, or they received all of this goodness, all of this holiness, because they didn't seek human consolation, because they didn't try to do things the human way. They received divine consolation. But as we said, especially according to St. Augustine, this is primarily about cultivating a disposition of the soul, right? whether or not we are physically able to turn the other cheek or to give away our things or what have you, we need to have such a disposition of the soul that we are ready to forgive everyone and everything. We are ready to be detached from our physical things. It's about what kind of person you're becoming. That's what these commandments are all about. It's not just about the rote execution of the commandments, but it's about transforming yourself. But notice one thing. A lot of these exceptions that I've said to these rules, they apply what? They apply if you're in a position of authority. They apply if you have a family. The exceptions, I mean, the exceptions apply if you have a family. The exceptions apply if you have property. What might that logically lead itself to? This is the foundation of monasticism. Monks and nuns are people who are trying to live out the commandments of Christ, literally, apply them with brutal strictness on themselves. That's what the first monks who went out, monasticism, in a sense, has been around since the very beginning of the church, but it really picked up steam in the 2nd century when a lot of Christians went out into the desert, like the physical desert in Egypt, and just tried to apply all of this rigidly to their life. Jesus says, don't be angry ever. Okay, I'm going to go through my entire life not being angry ever again. I'm not going to lust ever again. If anybody asks for my tunic, I'm going to give him my cloak as well. If anyone beats me, then I'm going to allow him to beat my other cheek. It's much harder. It gets a lot stickier and it gets a lot messier if you have a wife and children, if you have property, if you live incredibly simply, you don't have a family. It's much easier to turn the other cheek. Like Saint Seraphim of Sarov, very famously, when he was attacked by 3 robbers, he was attacked while he was chopping trees down with an axe. He was a physically robust man, so he could have maybe tried to fight him with the weapon he was holding. Instead, he puts the axe down, lies down, puts his hand on his chest, and let them beat him until he was physically kind of disabled. And of course, he received great grace from God from that. And he followed them to court later and begged for the judge to let them off the hook. That is a Christ-likeness. That is turning the other cheek. My goodness. I mean, and he became a saint. He became radiant. He worked miracles because of this. It's not just he ended up crippled and that's where the story ended, But not having a wife and kids, not having property makes you more able to do these things. Having wife and kids. I have a wife and kids. I have property. It's not a sin, but it makes it more complicated to fill the gospel commandments to the letter. So again, you can have people who are like, monasticism is not in the Bible. Jesus and Paul never told anyone to go out and become a monk. It's like, yeah, okay, on one level, that's true. They didn't found the literal orders of monasticism, but you get it very organically from the teachings of Jesus. And in fact, I would like to say that opponents of monasticism say, how do you propose, to apply these directly to your life without, making these kinds of sacrifices? Not to mention, both St. Paul and Jesus say it's better to be unmarried than to be married. They highly prize celibacy and virginity, but even besides just that one, dimension of giving up a family and sexual relations, giving up property, giving up everything like that makes it a lot easier to fulfill the commandments of Christ. I think I made my point. Someone raised their hand? Yeah.
Having family and these sort of tie you to the world more and kind of links you to the world more.
Yeah.
So it makes it more challenging to be in the world but not of it. And to really, I guess, master that would just to be a monastic and to really be in the world but be just in there for the prayer and for everyone else, but also separate from them without attaching with the family or with a job or something. I guess, I don't know. No, completely, exactly right. Exactly as the saints of our church would say it. The wife and family and career tie you to the world. That doesn't mean they're a sin, and it doesn't prevent you from going to heaven. That doesn't even prevent you from becoming a saint. There are people who have lived in the world. Saint Anthony, not the first monk, but the first great monk, the first well-known monk. It was revealed to him that there was someone
There was only one person, in the world who was his equal in spiritual struggle, and it was a man who lived in the world. I forget what his deal was, but he gave everything he had to the poor, and he sang hymns to God all day. And so the Holy Spirit revealed to St. Anthony, hey, there's someone who's not a monk who's doing just as good as you are, on the same level as you are. That being said, in general, it's easier when you're a monk or a nun. It's easier when it's much less complicated. For me, it's a complicated question to answer. How do I turn the other cheek when I have a wife and kids? And under what circumstance do I let someone who's physically dangerous get away with stuff? And under what circumstances do I have to try to stop them and in that way not abide by Jesus' commandments? A monk or nun, much easier. It's like, nope, I just let bad things happen to me and I just, meekly bow my head. But also just being attached to physical things is a big part of the equation. And definitely a married person can be completely detached from the world, and a monk or a nun can be completely attached to the world. So these are not foolproof things, but in general, that's the idea. Did you have a thought?
Yeah, it was just about St. Paul saying that it's better to be single.
Yeah, he does say that, and Jesus also says it in a more roundabout way. The disciples say, "Lord, it sounds like it would be better to be unmarried," and Jesus does not dispute that, but he says this is not for everyone, but only for those to whom it is given. So he doesn't anyway. Okay. Verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, and do good to those who hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So first of all, we should read these passages in light of the paragraph we just read. Jesus says, love your enemy. What does it mean to love your enemy? Well, it means when he strikes you, to give him your other cheek. It means when he demands your tunic, because people who hit you, people who take things from you, are your enemy. So when he strikes you, give him your other cheek. When he asks for your tunic, give your cloak also. When he compels you to go 1 mile, go with him too. To love your enemies, it's a disposition of the heart. It is at its core, but some people in the modern day think that love is primarily about emotions. And Jesus is not just saying have good feelings about your enemy. In fact, that's the hardest part of this equation. But Jesus is saying, based on the previous paragraph, do substantially good things for your enemy. Benefit them in real way, tangible ways, not just think nice thoughts about them. And that's, of course, obviously very hard and can feel humiliating, but that's what Jesus is calling us. So our love for enemies is to repay evil with good, not just to feel love for them in the sense of warm fuzzies in our heart, which we should do. It is ultimately about the disposition of the heart, but also about doing good for them in whatever way we can. Paul says love is the fulfillment of the law. In Romans chapter 13, verse 10. And that's just so interesting because, Jesus says that, he's come to fulfill the law, and then he's telling us that the law is fulfilled in love. Paul never heard Jesus preach, but Paul never met Jesus in this life. He only met him after the resurrection, but the coherence of the teaching lines up perfectly. And I just want to, mention that because modern scholars will try to cut up, the Gospels, they'll cut up the New Testament and say, oh, these are completely separate people who had their own teaching, and then someone at some point tied it all together and made a sort of amalgam tradition, called it Orthodox Christianity. And it's not true. It's there's one thread of teaching through the entire Bible because the Holy Spirit inspires it. Anyway, and so notice this also lines up with Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus is expanding the definition of neighbor, because everyone knows, all the Jews knew love your neighbor. They interpreted that then, and even now in the modern day with like some of the hardcore Orthodox Jewish sects, to really just mean the in-group, love your fellow Jew. That's what that meant to them. And Jesus is opening it up, saying even your enemy is your neighbor. And by the way, neighbor, I always read that, in English is the person who lives next to you. In Greek, plesion, it just means the person near you. I don't know if that's, I always thought, neighbor is just like the house next to my house is my neighbor, but it's more broad than that. So Jesus is expanding the law. Again, all the previous passages, what was he doing? He was expanding the law. Now he's expanding the law about to love your neighbor as well. We love our enemy when we desire his good. That's in chiefly salvation is someone's good. So the ultimate test of whether you love someone or not, this is something actually a holy monk once told me, to love someone is to desire that they be saved. That is the number one love you can have for someone, because that's the ultimate benefit anyone can receive. And Saint Silouan of Mount Athos says, by the way, love your enemies is possible only by the grace of God. You know, you can force yourself to give them your tunic. You can force yourself to turn the cheek, but the ultimate change of your heart, where you truly love them deeply, that's given by grace. So don't, look at this. These are challenging. Everything I've read so far is difficult. My goodness, to allow yourself to be robbed, to allow yourself to be beaten, to love the people who hate you and want to kill you. These are hard, extreme statements. And no wonder, Jesus really upset a lot of people with his teaching. It's far from the only extreme thing Jesus teaches in the Gospels. But this is, what's the standard? Well, he's telling us that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. That you may be sons of your Father's heaven. What is this? This is the Orthodox doctrine of deification. This is God-likeness is the standard. We are to be like God. We are to be what God is. And that definitely holds in terms of the ethical, moral precepts. We need to love like God loves. We need to forgive like God forgives. That's the standard. And that's what sets apart Christianity, by the way, from other teachings. Judaism, maybe you can kind of get something with the image of God, but it's certainly not a teaching widespread in Judaism. In Islam, no way. You're I was Googling around on this just to, preparation for this. In Islam, the only time it really talks about imitating God is that they say it's a sin to imitate God to imitate Allah by making images, because they have a whole thing about you're not supposed to depict living images, because then you're imitating him in his act of creation. So it is a unique thing that historical Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, this to say, teaches we are to be like God. This is deification. Like the idea of theosis, that human beings are to become God. It's not a later thing that the Orthodox made up. This is right. This is in Jesus's words. In fact, later on, he says it more strongly. You shall be perfect. Perfect. You shall not just be like God. It's not just like a light statement, like saying oh, God is kind, so you should also be kind. God is loving, you should also be loving. Jesus says you should be perfect, the way the supreme, pre-eternal, pre-existent foundation of all reality is perfect. Gosh, that's a huge statement. Anyway, Benjamin.
You said that we can all force ourselves to give up our tunic and force ourselves to do this and that, and it's a struggle. And I think that's true for pretty much everything we go through. But how are we supposed to know that what we're doing is actually love with grace, through grace?
That's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting question. And what you're asking is fundamentally, the highest rung of the ladder of divine ascent. We just celebrated St. John of the Ladder. The highest one of the highest rungs of the ladder of divine ascent is discernment of the will of God. So one of the highest Orthodox spiritual virtues is to know what is right and what's wrong, what's from God, what's from the devil, how to act in accordance with the will of God. And so that's me kind of punting on that question, because it's a really good one. And how do we know right if we're actually being Christ-like and we're actually doing God's will, versus if we're just being zealous or being stupid or what have you? I don't have it. I don't want to make a fool of myself by trying to pretend like I can answer your question satisfyingly right now. But work it out, live an Orthodox life with the spiritual life, with prayer and fasting, attendance in the services. Have a spiritual father whom you confess to and you can talk to, and I believe the will of God will be revealed in the concrete circumstances of your life. And I don't even mean that as a non-answer. I'm being serious. That's how we're called to address a whole lot of issues in our life, because there's a lot of complexities and ambiguities in life as Orthodox Christians, especially in the modern world. And so we really need to cultivate the lifestyle. And I believe God will give us the answers in the context of the life we live, if that makes sense. All right. Someone else here have a raised hand? Yeah.
Yes. So to like understand maybe how to discern, like, is that because, or could you do that through viewing it as, but let me try to phrase that because I'm tired. But like, so God is unconditional love,
Mhm.
the agape, and compassion and acceptance of that love is sort of maybe deification, like in a sense.
Yeah, it is. It just the difficult question about love is deification. Absolutely, totally correct statement. It gets froggy when you get to what is love and how does it manifest, because love means a lot of things in the modern day, some of which are antithetical to actual love. So definitely love is deification, but then the question, you're just kicking the can down the road a little bit to like, well, okay, what is love? What is love, and how does it actually manifest itself?
Would you say that love is like acceptance, acknowledgement, and sort of the appreciation of the essence of something as it is, rather than trying to judge it or control it or fear it?
I don't know, because especially I get a little froggy about the word acceptance, because that's a very modern therapy speak word that I don't know about, popping up in the Bible as much. I'm not saying we're anti-acceptance, we exclude. I'm not saying that, but I am saying I'm not ready to jump on that word immediately because I don't know how it would fit in exactly with like a traditional understanding. Is it accepting reality the way it is without trying to change it? I don't know. I can see situations where that would be a correct statement, and I could.
Purifying it and like turn it, like when they say like turn the other cheek, it's sort
Yeah.
of like you're taking that negative action or habit or belief from that person, because they're sort of just projecting their own internal negativity onto you.
Mhm.
And like with your love and forgiveness, you can kind of convert that into something positive.
For that more concrete example, yeah, I would say that's on track. That makes sense.
So I guess like love is converting all of the world into more love, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it definitely love is part of love is going to be filling the world with more love and perpetuating love, and just the way just how evil can propagate more evil, love can propagate more love. Yeah. But he makes the sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. And some really interesting lessons we can take away. First is that the character of God is manifest in the created order. So what Jesus is telling us is that we can, just by looking around at the natural and created world, we can discern some things about God. Now you have to be careful about that. You can go wrong with that too, as long as our spiritual vision is warped. But the things that are created reflect in some way the character of God. So on one level, Jesus is giving us a principle that we can live our lives by. And the fathers, talk about this. Physici theoria, the act of finding God through nature, was a legitimate pathway. Now it's you need to now in general the spiritual writers of more recent times would say you have to find God first, through prayer and contemplation, and then you will understand how he's in all nature, how everything speaks of him, because our minds are too warped. You could look at a beautiful mountaintop or seascape or whatever and still be an atheist or a Buddhist or whatever. But if you had a corrected spiritual vision, you would see how all of that speaks to the Holy Trinity, and how all of it reveals God. So God is revealed in nature, and that's, I think growth in your relationship with Christ it involves like a increasingly healthy appreciation of nature and of the created world. Certainly, I'm going through the Optina elders again, who are, Russian elders and saints of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and I'm just reading Elder Barsanufius right now before I go to bed, and he just loves nature, and all he wants to do is just soak up nature and soak up the beauty of it, and he's a very holy man. Anyway, it's a side point, but it's relevant. Anyway, and notice that as long as we draw breath, God is showing mercy to us. If you are awake to see the sunrise, Jesus is telling you that's God showing you love. If you have rain so that crops grow, God is showing you his love, without getting into the conflict dynamics of the water cycle and the precipitation and this and that. It is that's all true and that's all real, obviously, but what it originates in, that's God showing His love. As long as you can say it in the negative sense, as long as you draw breath, you have time to repent. As long as you are alive on this earth, you are not in hell, and you should consider that a good thing. But you have an opportunity to be saved, and God is giving you that opportunity because He wants you to draw closer to Him. He wants you to find Him in every single day. He is extending your life so that you can increase in your relationship with Him, and build up as much spiritual capital as you can so that you can have the best possible experience of eternity with Him. So every single day is mercy from God. But just that's it. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And that's such a critical point about especially reading the previous passages about not resisting an evil person, turning the other cheek. Because if you observe the old law of Moses, you take vengeance, but only proportional vengeance. That's not really exceptional. You are not a remarkably holy person if you for any of that. You are a remarkably holy person if you turn the other cheek. You are a remarkably holy person if someone abuses you and you actually give your stuff away to them and help them. It's just, if you love those who love you, even, Adolf Hitler loved his family, and he had people he loved. Everyone, that's not exceptional. That's not morally upright. It's just normal. It's just natural to love people who love you. Although St. Theophylakt of Ohrid says, be careful and use this as fuel for your repentance, because often we don't even show love to the people who love us. In the specific examples he gives is often we envy people who love us, or we don't. And we said, what love is what? Well, a big part of what love is to desire their good. And sometimes we look at our friends or family members and we see them succeed a little too much. We don't want them, we want good things for them, but we don't want them to outshine us, or we don't want things to go too good for them. Or we outright envy them. And these are definitely ways in which we're worse than the tax collectors. We're worse than the people who, even though they're evil in other ways, they desire good for the people who love them, and so on and so forth. So, we should use that as fuel for repentance. Think about it. Not only do I not love my enemies, but I often don't even love my friends. It should help us understand, why this standard is so high. And if you greet your brethren only, what do you more than others? And I like this one because this is one we can apply in our daily lives. Greet people, just saying hi to people, just being friendly to people. This is something we can apply to our lives today. We can take this teaching of Jesus and start, being open and friendly, and not putting on a mutra, as we say in Greece, like a face, like, when you're walking through a place, like you're too good to talk to anybody, or you wait for someone to approach you, is so that, they have to come to you. You don't go to them. No, greet people, be friendly to them, be open to them, and don't act too cool for anybody. That's a very easy thing we can start applying to our lives. Therefore, you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So the preceding precepts are difficult. Everything we've said in these last two paragraphs is very, very hard. But that's what perfection is. Perfection is the pinnacle. Perfection is the top of the mountain. Jesus is here to make us perfect and to make us God. And nothing less than like the highest of high standards is what it's going to take. However, the saints of the church are often are want to tell us that any of our failings in any of these respects can be made up for by humility, a really deep humility, where we say, Lord, I know I'm supposed to, love my enemies, but I just can't do it. I just don't have it in me to give away my cloak. I just don't have it. Now, of course, you can use that as an excuse. Say, oh, the reason I'm not turning the other cheek is because I'll just get away with humility. No, it's supposed to be something more profound than that. It's supposed to be something you really wrestle with. You should look at yourself and say, I really tried. I just can't turn the other cheek, or I just can't do this. Lord, forgive me. I'm a failure. I'm a sinner. I can't live up to your commandments. And your failure will be covered by your humility. So there's always a possibility for everyone, even in our weakness. So just be aware of that. But we should look at these as the standard to strive for. We should look at these and say, this is how I'm supposed to live. And every day that I don't succeed, I'm failing as a Christian. I know it sounds harsh, but Jesus is speaking harshly. And again, Father Theodore, I'm failing too. I'm not like looking around like you're all sinners, but like I've done these commandments. No, I definitely have not. But we need to have that in mind, that every day I'm failing to live up to what Jesus wants of me, and what Jesus did himself. He's not just issuing the commandment to us and making us comply, but he lived up to every single thing here. Benjamin.
Something I think I'm still confused about, because I haven't really gotten a clear idea from the fathers. Is that pinnacle, that peak salvation, or the humility, and there is no salvation in between? Or is there salvation on like a spectrum of like you might not have that full amount of humility, but you're still saved, or you might be halfway up the mountain, but you're still saved? I don't know.
Yeah, I would say there's definitely, even within our contradiction, even within our tradition, there's some level of maybe contradiction isn't the word I want to use, but definitely there's statements by different fathers that don't line up. So I was reading in the prologue to the Philokalia just yesterday or the day before, St. Nicodemus the Hagiorite says, unless you are deified, you cannot be saved. Whoa. Unless you are deified, you cannot be saved. That's going to be like, a dozen people. Like that's going to be like, that's an incredibly strong statement. And yet we have all these experiences of the saints where, it was revealed to them that many ordinary people were saved. So we shouldn't maybe take that statement at fully face value, right? But there are a couple things to keep in mind. One is that salvation is a process. So we are in the process of being saved. And in a certain sense, even when we're in heaven, it's going to be a process. We're going to be being saved even while we're in heaven. That is to say, we're going to be moving deeper and deeper into our experience in knowledge of God. So on one level, there isn't a concrete point to where someone is saved or not saved. At the same time, there is a difference between, going to heaven or going to hell or going to Hades. And now I'm just trying to lay out all the resources to think about this stuff, because like I said, the tradition itself doesn't necessarily give a fully clear answer. So to be deified is to be deified. Obviously you will be saved, but have humility instead and you'll be saved. But this humility in and of itself might be a deification, because Christ was more than anything, in addition to his love, was defined by his humility. So I don't have a neat tie it with a bow little answer I could give you, but hopefully I'm just giving some things that'll help you chew on it and think about it more. Landon, do you have a hand raised? Okay. So earlier in this chapter, just in summation, so therefore you shall be perfect. These laws are not impossible. The fathers want us to say they were fulfilled among the saints both before and after Christ. So even David turned to the other cheek with Saul. Saul was trying to kill him, but David was not trying to retaliate to Saul. So Saint Stephen prayed for the people who were killing him, and so on. So in the Old and New Testament, and then the lives of the saints, many, many more. Who, like I mentioned, Saint Seraphim Sarov, who really lied down and took a beating, even to the point of being physically disabled. So these are things that can be done, and the fruits of that, is in the sanctity of these people. So we're not given the excuse. It's like, oh, these are just nice, lofty ideals, but they're not, for me to apply. No, they were applied. So, the saints on one level accuse us by their lives. Anyway, but earlier in this chapter, Jesus taught us how to not to even begin to do wrong in our thoughts. Now he tells us to repay evil with good. This is a roadmap to perfection. So we should see this entire preceding chapter as a sort of progression. Oftentimes, because the Bible's divided up into these neat little verses, that's very helpful. That obviously the original text of the Bible didn't have chapters and verses. They were added relatively recently, I think in the last 500 years, or something like that. But I think sometimes we tend to read the Bible in like little discrete chunks. We tend to take little verses and isolate them from the rest of the text, and that's fine. That has its place. But at the same time, the whole we should not forget that it is a unified text, in that it's meant to be read as a whole. So we should, read verses in context of the verse that came before them and came after them, and with other parts of the Bible that they may reference. So earlier in this chapter, Jesus taught us not how to not wrong even in our thoughts. So the first level is do no wrong even in your thoughts. The next level is even when you get wrong done to you, repay it with good. So this is a roadmap to perfection. We should see this as Jesus giving us a blueprint for our lives, or like a plan of how to live. The first thing is to do no wrong. The second is to repay what wrong we do experience with good. And this is this is something I try to emphasize. The Orthodox life, the Christian life, it's something in which we're supposed to progress. We're supposed to be moving forward. It's not just a set of dead rules, but it's something that like gives us life if we follow it. Which so often we don't. Anyway. Okay, any more final questions? Yeah. I'll go Landon first.
So I'm pretty sure somewhere else in here he talks about divorce, and how he kind of he says that in the Old Testament, like, divorce was permitted, but now he's like toughening it up and making it not permitted. So I was just kind of wondering, like, what the church's whole stance on, like, if they if like a couple were to be divorced, like, is it like an annulment, or how does that kind of
so that was in the last Bible study. Thank you for bringing it up. Jesus says that yes, whoever divorces, furthermore it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who's divorced commits adultery. So yes, what Jesus is telling us, that in the original law, divorce was for the hardness of people's hearts. It was an important provision in that and it's a true provision. Everything in the Torah is inspired by God. So I'm not ever saying anything bad about the Old Testament, but it was necessary for a Bronze Age society to be able to hold together and to have some measure of justice. However, it's not perfect. What's perfect is one man, one woman for life, period. And however, even in the modern day, Jesus, even given all that, Jesus says, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality. So he admits that there are situations where a marriage can be dissolved. And so the Orthodox Church does permit divorces. You get up to 3 marriages in the Orthodox Church, so use them wisely. After 3, you're just not meant to be married. If you go through 3 divorces, then your single life is good for you, right? I mean, that should be logical. And that's and we're hardcore about that. I mean, that's what the whole Ivan the Terrible thing was about. Ivan the Terrible tried to marry a 4th time, and the church wouldn't have it. And basically, the kingdom, among other reasons, the kingdom devolved into like civil war. Basically, he waged war on his own people because he wanted to do things his own way, and the people were Orthodox Christians. They said, no, our leader has to have a standard. That's why you look at and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on specific politicians, but I mean, come on, the standard is so low at this point. Like, don't we have any? It's unbelievable. I mean, it's Christians used to care about that sort of thing. Anyway, yeah, so the Orthodox Church allows up to 3 marriages, and then with regret, the ideal is still one man, one woman for life. But the world is what it is, and you have to have a way back for people. And so it's not an annulment; it's a divorce. We don't do annulments, or maybe we do, but they're extremely rare if we do. Benjamin?
Does the Orthodox Church consider those marriages to specifically be like Orthodox liturgical marriages, or I know it's probably like kind of wishy-washy now in the modern era, but was it traditionally considered that, or is it now?
Yeah. So basically, the Orthodox Church has historically not regarded marriages of Orthodox people that take place outside of the Orthodox Church. It hasn't regarded them as marriages. So I know that slightly sounds like a contradiction, where I've said, the Orthodox Church, if we see 2 Muslims who are married, we consider them married, right? They're not fornicating. At the same time, it has always been, if you're an Orthodox Christian and you choose to get married outside of the church deliberately, you are no longer in communion with the church, and what you are doing is fornication. It is cohabitation. So basically, no. I've had to deal with a situation where someone came to me. They were married more than 3 times, but outside of the church. And I got permission from the hierarchy to say, no, we don't count those. And they got married in the church and they're fine. That's the answer. Okay. Well, but you know, within reason, right? If someone has a really, really crazy track record, you're going to want to at least think about it as a priest, right? Whether you're willing to grant another marriage, even if it was all outside of the church before, you're willing to grant the marriage all willy-nilly. Anyway, Christ our God, you are the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. You have completed the divine plan of the Father. Fill our hearts with joy and gladness, always now and ever into the ages of ages. Amen. All right. God bless you guys. Have a good day.
Since I don't have to be married to Cheryl.